What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus O'Coffrey here, doing another episode of Level Up, the personal branding podcast, looking at musicians again. This is another trios, and in this episode, going to look at James Brown, Sly Stone, and George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, and Parliament Funkadelic. P-Funk's in the house, everybody. So this is sort of a extension of the funk in the one episode, because I talk about the history of the funk and what is funk. And these everybody sort of agrees that the three or the four. I mean, I'm the title will only have James and Sly and George, but you know, Bootsy's there, you know, in the mix now. Allude to him, and he's part of George Clinton's P-Funk. So those four really are, everybody kind of agrees, they're the Mount Rushmore of funk. So I guess I'll start with each of them individually and talk a little bit about their branding and what they did and what they brought to the funk, and then you know, dive into the funk a little more. So James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, the Godfather of soul. He came out with both of those. James was a relentless tourer, and he was an amazing performer. One of the interesting things, if you, a lot of people kind of lose sight of, you know, James Brown and Jackie Wilson. And Jackie Wilson was, I think he was Mr. Dynamite, Mr. Excitement was his thing. You know, and the difference between James and Jackie, because Jackie was, you know, when you talk about great dancers, I mean, most people think it starts with James and then, you know, Michael and Prince, but, you know, Jackie, you know, he was right there. He was right there, you know, with James, had his own style. Probably, you know, most people would consider, you know, James, then Jackie, just like most people when it comes to dance would, you know, Michael, then Prince. But the thing about Jackie is that voice. I mean, he arguably has, you know, one of the best voices in the history of R&B. His range. I don't know if he'd get as high as Prince, but he had a better lower register than Prince did, and no other male singer I can think of has the range and the register that Jackie Wilson had. So it's interesting, and you know, but you know, the what boils down between James and Jackie is management. Jackie Wilson had terrible management, and you know, rumored, you know, that, you know, his management had mafia ties. So, you know, hey. One of the interesting tidbits about James is he was one of the first artists to gain, you know, control of his masters. And I mean, in the early 60s, you know, 63, 64, 65, he owned all his masters. And, you know, even the comparison to you know, white artists. I mean, the Stones, somewhere in the late 60s, they got their masters. I think it was after maybe the Satanic, Her Majesty's Satanic Verses. I don't know, or what. I probably got the title of that album wrong, the 67 album. But, you know, Paul McCartney didn't get, you know, the Beatles catalog back until 2013, 2014, 2015. So, you know, the fact that James owned his own catalog in the mid 60s is amazing. Now, you know, James was an entrepreneur. I mean, I think he owned a jet at some, but James had a lot of businesses in the 70s, you know, outside. You know, he owned radio stations, quite a few radio stations, and he had other. So James was a businessman. Now, you know, when it all, I can't really blame James for his will, because, you know, I think the will finally in 2019, 2020 was finally, you know, got through all the court cases, and but But interestingly, I mean, James wanted to give most of his money to charity, and that's not what really happened, which is interesting because I know James had, the lawyers in there and did a legal will, but and James's catalog sold for a ridiculously low amount of money for James Brown. It was either $40 or $60 million, and James is the most sampled, artist in hip hop history. So, but it was the family was fighting and divided. So that's what the catalog's a lot cheaper when people aren't on the same page. And unfortunate, but anyway, I mean, so James's brand. I mean, businessman. Which kind of the black power and do for yourself and say it loud, I'm black and proud from the late '60s. Build up your community. James is big, with that. Side note on James. So he was supposed to do a concert in Boston the night April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated, and he went along and did the concert. It's actually on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. But he put the concert on, live TV for everybody, on all ABC, CBS, and NBC in Boston, and ran it. And so Boston, every major city rioted except Boston and Indianapolis. And here in Indianapolis, Bobby Kennedy spoke and calmed the crowd. So James, had a lot of clout outside of, was very revered and respected in the black community politically, in the 60s and the 70s. So, I mean, that's James's brand was, hardworking, the Godfather. I mean, I'm sure he took that out of the movie, but he kind of was the Godfather. He's the Godfather of Funk, the Godfather. So, I mean, he was an innovator. One of the interesting things, I mean, the soul of hip hop, even though, going back to Motown and the Stax, their greatest hits, the soul of hip hop, but it also goes, yes, the grittiness of hip hop, that part of the soul goes back to Stax, but the approach to music really goes back to James, because hip hop has always been a very stripped down music. If you really looked, compared to other forms, I mean, there's not, particularly pop. I mean, there's not a lot going, oftentimes it's a beat and a bass line and a couple other things. And, so James really stripped everything down to let the music breathe and let the funk, go through so you can groove. I mean, if you throw too much stuff over a funky groove, it kind of smothers it and it's not as funky as it should be. James's other big thing is James turned everything into a drum. And, everything became a percussive instrument, even his grunts and his groans and his screeches and all that. Those were, percussive instruments. The chicken scratch guitar, I mean, turning the guitar into a percussive instrument. The horns, bump, 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 bump. I mean, those short bursts, again, mimicking a drum. So he turned everything into a drum. And in hip hop, for the most part, I mean, Ye gets extravagant and kind of brings in, at times, but Ye can also get very strict. I mean, Ye's all over the place, but he'll go into, he'll get kind of Mozart and get really fancy on this every once in a while, and that's a good thing. So that's James. And going back to James, again, nobody else used the horns like James. I mean, he turned it into percussive instrument. I mean, when you think of great horn sections from the funk era, I mean, you got, Sly had a great horn section, George and P-Funk, Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind, and Fire. They sort of went back to the jazz era, the big band era, and kind of, had that same approach. I mean, even though Casey and the Sunshine Band is technically a disco band, but they're a disco band with a lot of funk elements. And man, I love, well, their horn section. So yeah, so I mean, but James is alone and really sets himself apart when it comes to how he uses horns. Jimmy Nolan, used that chicken scratch guitar that is so associated with funk and then later disco, and then Prince would use that chicken scratch guitar as well. Um, so yeah, so that's James. Sly Stone, multiracial band, very influenced Prince, and when he was forming the revolution out of the Bay Area. Interesting thing about Sly and the Family Stone, his sister Rose and brother Freddie were in the band. Um, and this is a band that could, get up on stage with the Motown Revue when they were in town, but then get up and you know, open or close, but take your pick, for Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and the other great rock Santana, folks from that Bay Area, and Sly Stone is really that first of the funk rock bands, so to speak, that straddled that line. I mean, obviously Funkadelic from, the Funkadelic part of Parliament Funkadelic, or the early Funkadelic stuff has that rock element too. And there's other, I mean, Wild Cherry Player, Funky Music, White Boy. I mean, there's definitely a rock element to that as well. But, they were, Sly and the Family Stone was the first to kind of marry rock and funk. Um, there's also a psychedelic aspect, coming out of the Bay that, um, particularly that first album, I think Journey to the Center of Your Heart, not a lot of hits on that first Sly Stone album, but it was still a good album. And, they sprinkle in, the psychedelia, throughout, those 60s albums. And I mean, so before Purple Rain, there was Stand. That's Sly's big album. Take a listen. It's classic. I mean, it's made the top 100 in the Rolling Stone. The 3 times they did the 500 greatest albums of all time. I mean, it's there. Under 80. I mean, it's a powerhouse album, and it's still a classic. Um, Sly struggled with fame. He and drugs, but fame more so. I think that the drugs and the fame kind of go hand in hand. Um, but one of the things with Sly that was interesting that George and Sly's first band in the early 60s was a doo-wop band, and a lot of people don't know that. But George Clinton, I mean, before it was Parliament, it was the Parliaments, and they were a doo-wop. They started off on the street corner singing doo-wop. So it's interesting that George and Sly both come out of the doo-wop, and it comes out in how they used the various vocalists in the band in their songs. I mean, because it's rare, in the early Sly Stone and certainly the P-Funk stuff in the 70s where there's just one singer. A lot of times there's you sing a verse here, you sing a verse there, and Prince kind of paid homage to that, in the song 1999. The other famous outside of Sly and the Family Stone is Larry Graham, and Larry's most famous for the slap bass, and he really that gained prominence. Thank you for letting me be myself again. That's where he kind of and very very influential, and even today funk bassists talk about you know Larry Graham, the finger pop and the slap bass. But the other thing that people miss about Larry Graham and you know and the what he brings to the table and what Sly brings to the table via Larry Graham is the idea of the fat bass. And so if you dance to the music, uh Larry Graham puts his bass through a fuzz box and it gets really thumping and really fat. He did it again and dance. I think My Lady, he did it again too. But that set the stage for the fat bass era of funk in the late '70s, early '80s. Talking about Lakeside and Zap and the Ohio, the no, the Gap Band, uh, even Midnight Star, the Daz Band, that really fat bass. And Larry put that idea out there. And, when I mean, George picked up on it and Bernie Worrell picked up on it for Flashlight when, they took the Mini Moog and did the Flashlight, the whole song on the Mini Moog bass. That's going back to Larry Graham and, dance to the music and that bass through the fuzz box. But it was in the late '70s when all those dudes, when they got a hold of that Roland SH-101 and, building on, the Mini Moog and really came to that fat bass. And it's still very prevalent in hip hop today. Think, Energy by Drake, Jumpman by Drake, Zero to 100 by Drake, Astronaut in the Ocean by Masked Wolf. There's a booming system by LL Cool J. I mean, that fat bass has been around ever since. And Colors by Ice-T, Squeeze the Trigger by Ice-T. I mean, that fat bass goes back. But that idea was put out there by Larry Graham. And so a lot of people miss that everybody talks about the slap bass and the finger popping with Larry Graham, but that fat bass, Larry Graham dropped that and planted that seed. So Sly Stone's brand, well, he kind of blew the boundaries out of what's considered music and would go anywhere. I mean, funk, psychedelia, rock. He kind of did it all, and he was the first to really have a true integrated racial band. And so that's I mean off the, and then bringing the bass to into the funk mainstream. So it's interesting because when I look at hip hop in the early '90s in the sampling era, I mean you have the East Coast, which is very James Brown. I think I mentioned this in another episode. Other than X-Clan, which is into the fat bass, and the West Coast, that G-Funk, very fat bass, very. I mean, NWA sampled "Dance to the Music" in their first album, so very Larry Graham-esque, Sly-esque on the West Coast, and so that's kind of the breakdown. Finally, my man George Clinton. Love me some George. So George comes out of New Jersey, and we drive back and forth between New Jersey to Detroit. Wrote music for a while there with Motown, and nothing really moved there. But he was in the mix. And I've talked about this before, but Detroit in the late '60s, you had. You had Motown going on. You had the Stooges with Iggy Pop, and the beginnings of punk, and then MC5, and then then you also have Alice Cooper coming to town in the early '70s. You have all this crazy energy going on, and then George, is in that and comes out of that. And I mentioned earlier, I mean, Bootsy started with James, and kind of helped James. He and James worked on that version of the one where the one and the bass drum, and and Sly, sometimes syncing his bass up with that bass drum, and then he hooks up with George, and it just takes off. So George had a different approach, than James. I mean, James stripped everything down, and George kind of went the opposite way. It was kind of organized confusion, I think. I mean, it's impossible to really. I've seen some folks do some pretty good cover versions of P-Funk live, because P-Funk essentially was a jam band. If you're a good jam band, you can do a pretty decent rendition of P-Funk live. But very few people have tried to cover George and P-Funk, because it is hard to really do justice, because George just thought so much out of the box. And so, yeah, P-Funk was not stripped down. There was a lot of vocal stuff going on, and the doo-wop influence was there. And George just surrounded himself with a lot of good musicians. And George rolled strong. I just saw George last summer, full P-Funk mode. I mean, was that the fifth time I've seen George, maybe? And the last couple of times, George had, a band of 12, 15. Not this time. George was 20, 22 strong, and that's really what a P-Funk, party's all about. But yeah, so I really look at, three phases of the funk for me, and that's, James and Sly in the beginning, George in the middle, and then, what I'm going to call that third generation that I named them off earlier, that bass funk in the late 70s and early 80s. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell. So George, I mean, wild hair. He had wild hair. If you look at him, they had a dude, concert wore the diaper. I remember a video somewhere, one of their concerts, they had a big old muscular, this dude must have been 6'2", 250 pounds, and a white wedding dress. I mean, you never knew what you were getting with P-Funk, visually. And, their music was just on a different level. They really brought... science fiction, he landed, in the late 70s, he landed the mothership, on stage. And so George is in some ways the first breakout Afrofuturist. I mean, Samuel Delaney had some really good stuff. And, later, I mean, can't remember quite when Octavia Butler drops. It's sometime in the 70s. But, I mean, Octavia Butler is certainly getting her just due now, but George, I mean, those three are, when it comes to black science fiction fantasy, I mean, George is right there. He probably kicked the door open, even though Samuel Delaney was before him, and Octavia Butler is the queen of black science fiction fantasy, but the three of them, I write science fiction and fantasy, so I have to give all three of them props, and I do. Can't talk about P-Funk, though, without all of the characters George created. Dr. Funkenstein, Sir Nose, Sir Nose never wanted to dance, but, he always ended up dancing in the end. In some ways, George is poking at the black bourgeoisie a little bit. And then Bootsy had Bootzilla and Casper. So they were just really innovative with the little, or with the personas that, George and Bootsy created for themselves. And George always said, music's one thing, but if you can create a character, the character will live on forever. And all three of these artists had a political edge to them. And James had "Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud. I don't want nobody to give me nothing. I'll get it myself." I mean, this is going back to, when people think Black Power, they're kind of like back in the day, they're like, ooh, Black Power. But James is like, do for yourself. Take care of your own business to Black people. Soul Power. So Sly had "You Can Make It If You Try, Don't Call Me Nigger Whitey." Stand and "I Want to Take You Higher." So Sly had his own politics, but and of course, when there's a riot going on, kind of the bitterness looking back at the '60s is very evident in that album. And in the '70s, he's not as political as he was in the '60s, but and P-Funk, even though George talks, in his autobiography, politics gets you in trouble. I mean, on the slide, George is very political. Me and my folks, I want to know if it's good to you. This is all from early Funkadelic. Bot Gun, Endangered Species. Come on now. Aqua Boogie. Deep. So George, Chocolate City. I mean, George got into the politics too, even though he says he didn't. But good stuff from all of them. So yeah, I've been waiting to do this episode for a minute. I love my funk, and hey, I had to lay it down and do one more funk, least on the docket, and it's the next couple of weeks. That's the transition from funk to hip hop, and that's when I'll kind of focus on that third generation of funk. Because as I said earlier, I consider the first generation of funk to be James and Sly, and that second generation to be P-Funk, and that last generation to be the funk bass heads, the Dayton scene, the Ohio scene, because Lakeside, Ohio Players, Zapp and Roger, all out of little old Dayton, and I think I'm missing somebody out of that, but and then you got Midnight Star coming out of Cincinnati, but don't forget Bootsy came out of Cincinnati too, and then you got the Daz Band coming out of Cleveland, but also the OJs came out of Cleveland too. So there's Ohio's kind of like late 70s, early 80s, like the epicenter for funk. So anyway, we're gonna, that's, I was in Ohio, I was in middle school in the late 70s, and in high school in the early 80s. So you wonder why my music's so bass heavy. Well, hey, it's that Ohio thing, baby. OHIO, as the Ohio Players would say. So anyway, loved, had fun with this. Some more funk is coming down the road. There's some more funk on my album 5. I'm getting close to getting ready to drop that. So anyway, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I got 2 novels and talked a little bit about, Afrofuturism and black science fiction fantasy. Well, hey, I got 2 novels on Amazon and a novella. So yeah, so check all that stuff out. 4 albums out. Got it here on YouTube, and it's on all the streaming services. Exodus. Check it out on Music Under Exodus. So thanks for coming through, and I will see you next episode.